Today's webinar is Serving Incarcerated Survivors Beyond Basic Services. I'll look at what's possible for rape crisis centers who are ready to move beyond providing the basic services. When we say basic services, we mean forensic exam accompaniment and emotional support to incarcerated survivors via letter and/or hotline. So beyond basic services, we consider to be in-person services, either one-on-one counseling or groups. Whether your agency has a long established practice of providing basic services at your nearby detention facilities and you're now ready to expand upon those, or if you're brand new to working with survivors in detention and you're still working to establish a relationship with your local facilities, we welcome you today. We hope that this webinar is helpful for you as you set long-term goals for providing regular in-person services to survivors behind bars. A bit of housekeeping: all attendees to this webinar will receive a follow-up email today, which will contain a certificate of attendance, links to previously recorded webinars and other resources that we'll be mentioning, and a survey. I am Matthew Van Winkle. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a senior program officer with Just Detention International, or JDI for short. I'm joined today by my colleagues from JDI and CALCASA.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Mady. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a senior program officer with Just Detention International.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Marcela Rojas Salas. I'm a program coordinator for CALCASA, and I use she, her pronouns. So the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault is committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. CALCASA provides leadership, vision, and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. And CALCASA envisions a world free from sexual violence.
Thank you, Marcella. And Just Detention International, or JDI for short, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. It's JDI's belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. And we're able to speak to you today because of funding from the California Office of Emergency Services. We are the California Advancing PREA project, funded by Cal OES, which allows CALCASA and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California rape crisis centers on how to build strong relationships with correctional facilities in order to make sure that incarcerated survivors have access to the confidential emotional support services PREA entitles them to. For those who may not know already, PREA is the acronym for Prison Rape Elimination Act, a federal law enacted in 2003 aimed at making all American detention facilities safer by requiring them to take certain steps to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse and sexual harassment of those in custody. While you may hear occasional references to California's state prisons and county jails during this webinar, the basic information we're going to provide is really relevant to anywhere in America. Any rape crisis center with a detention facility in its service area, outside or inside of California. And today we'll begin by discussing some of what should be in place at your agency before you undertake expanding upon those basic services. Then we'll move on to what advocacy looks like in a detention setting and discuss providing in-person services, both one-on-one support and groups. Please type any questions you might have into the questions pane of the control panel. We'll be monitoring your questions as we go. We'll answer the questions we receive at the end of the webinar. And if we don't know the answer to a question you ask us right away, we will follow up with you privately at a later time. We encourage you to please take care of yourself during this webinar. We know that these are kind of different times we're living in the last several weeks and into the next little bit of the future here. We hope everyone listening is healthy, taking care of themselves, and able to kind of find ways to keep themselves feeling refreshed, even in these kind of yeah, I'll say it. These are scary times and very untested and unprecedented times. We want to make sure that you stand up, stretch, and take care of yourself today. So before we dive in, let's restate the problem. According to an estimate by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in U.S. prisons and jails each year. Note that this figure represents the number of people, not the number of incidents, because many of these 200,000 people are abused more than once, not always by the same perpetrator. The available data on perpetrators of abuse in adult detention settings is nearly equally split between inmate on inmate abuse and abuse which is perpetrated by staff. By staff, we mean not only uniformed correctional officers or deputies, but anyone who works at a detention facility. That could include people like mental health staff, teachers, culinary or kitchen staff, or volunteers. This is what we know from the BJS data. And it's also important to remember that when we use the term incarcerated survivors, we're not only talking about people who were assaulted during their time in incarceration, we're also talking about people who were survivors prior to coming into the facility. So what does PREA require? PREA requires, it provides a floor of basic common sense access to advocates and their services for incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. These are the basics. Facilities must attempt to enter into a memorandum of understanding, or MOU, with community service providers, such as rape crisis centers, who can provide confidential emotional support services related to sexual abuse. Facilities must provide mailing addresses and telephone numbers to the inmate population for rape crisis organizations so that they can reach out if they need to, without making any kind of administrative step or making any kind of report. They should have that access. Facilities must make inmates aware of the extent to which such communications with rape crisis centers will be treated confidentially. And facilities must make victim advocates available to survivors during forensic medical examinations and investigatory interviews. There is nothing in the PREA standards that requires facilities to allow in-person follow-up counseling sessions with survivors or to allow rape crisis agencies to offer groups. So the things we're going to be talking about today are not things that are backed up or enshrined by the PREA law. They are really going to be reliant on your ability to partner with your facility, make sure that they understand the value of your services to survivors, and that value actually trickles down into the safety and security of their facilities as well. And before we do a little bit of a deeper dive into the services, we want to assess where you're at in your advocacy work and know where you're at with the relationship you hold with your local facility staff and survivors in detention. So let's take a quick poll. This is a true or false. The statement is, my agency provides all of these services to incarcerated survivors: letter writing, hotline, and forensic exam accompaniment. Just select one and select the one that is correct for you. All right, with just about 75% here, it is exactly split 50-50. This is fine. We want to let you know that there are resources available at CALCASA's website for you to familiarize yourself with regarding getting some of those basic services started, but we do think there will be value in this webinar for you as well. And for those of you who are already doing those basic floor of services, we look forward to kind of benefiting from some of your experience and some of the questions you might have on how to expand. So how do you know your agency is ready to begin offering expanded in-person services? Here are some things that should already be in place, a little checklist that we put together so you know if you're ready to take that next step. First, you should have a memorandum of understanding in place with your facilities, and it should be current. It should contain specific language around the different services you provide, and these should include, at a minimum, forensic exam accompaniment, access to your agency's hotline, access to your agency's address for written correspondence, and it should state that the facility will facilitate some form of in-person follow-up services, which will be confidential. So the MOU should kind of glance at this as a possibility, in-person services, even if they're not currently happening. California's state prison system, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, or CDCR, has increased the expectation for hotline calls and written correspondence by pledging that outbound calls to rape crisis centers from inside the facility will be free of charge, not monitored, and not recorded. CDCR's PREA leadership has also recognized that mail that goes back and forth between advocates and incarcerated survivors should be treated as confidential and never opened by staff except in the presence of the survivor, and even then still not read, just checked for contraband before being handed to the recipient. Even with, it's important, we're kind of bragging on California here, but we want to make sure that it's clear it's still not a lock that these services are going to be provided. It takes a lot of checking in to make sure the hotline numbers are working. It takes a lot of training and retraining staff to make sure that they know what the expectation is for privileged communication by mail. So it always takes a little bit of oversight and checking in. And once you've confirmed that you have a solid memorandum of understanding, which would support an expansion of your services, it's time to take a look at your agency's practices. We've observed over time that having these practices in place really sets agencies up to be able to expand on their services and make those services sustainable. First, you should be maintaining contact with at least one or two staff at the facility who are in a position to help you gain access. These should be staff members who understand your services and why they're important, and the unique role that rape crisis advocates have in the PREA law. They can help message about these services to both inmates as well as their colleagues. This could be a mental health director, a captain, a warden or associate warden, or the PREA compliance manager herself, who of course will have a separate title or rank. You should also have firsthand experience with the facility. At a minimum, you should have already taken a tour, and newly hired advocates at your agency who will be doing work there should also be sent on tours as part of their onboarding. This practice indicates that your agency's taking ownership over the work there at the facility, and it demonstrates your professional reliability to the staff at the prison. You should have rapport and trust between your agency and the facility. This is not to say that you should be trying to be best friends, but rapport and respect are essential. You need to make sure to maintain always your professional role, which is to be there for the survivors. And you must always maintain in your mind an understanding of the power differential between staff at the facility and those who are held in custody. When we say rapport, we don't mean that you allow facility staff to kind of undermine your own confidence in the importance of your services, or make you aware of things that you don't want to know, such as perhaps someone's crime, why they're in there. Rather, what we mean is that you should have the kind of relationship where your expertise in trauma-informed care is respected and your input is sought out, just as you will look to the facility staff for guidance when it comes to staying in line with rules and regulations and best practices. You should also have a good working knowledge of the PREA standards, especially, but not limited to, those standards that speak to the rights of incarcerated survivors to have access to confidential emotional support services, whether the abuse occurred in custody or at any time prior, and regardless of the status of an investigation. Finally, You'll want to make sure that your agency has intake forms that are appropriate for all survivors, including those who may be in detention. What we mean by this is there should be space on your form to collect information, your intake form, to collect information such as an inmate ID number or the name of the facility at which they're held.
Thank you, Matthew. So a large role that advocates provide is, well, advocacy. And advocacy on behalf of a survivor can be especially important for clients who are incarcerated, as their voices are often not heard. Also, in a prison or jail setting, the voice of outsiders, such as an advocate from a rape crisis center, are often heard louder than the voices of those who are inside. Even if you're not yet offering in-person support at your facility, you can still provide advocacy on behalf of the survivors that call your hotline, write your agency letters, or that you see at a forensic exam. While we all strongly believe in empowering survivors to make their own actions and choices, speaking up on behalf of a survivor who has already tried several remedies and has still not been heard may be a place that we can provide real support. There are many reasons that you may be asked to provide advocacy on behalf of an incarcerated survivor, or where you may be able to offer some advocacy. Some of the most obvious times we may speak up on behalf of a client is if they feel that their immediate safety is at risk. Perhaps they've tried to report abuse several times and know that they have to see the abuser in the near future and are worried about their safety. This is a time we can speak up. Another issue we may be able to address is housing. If a survivor is letting you know that their housing is making them unsafe, that they need single cell status to continue to heal and not be triggered, or that they're in need of some sort of protective custody, these may be things that you can bring up to a facility. Many survivors that we work with contact advocates about issues that they have had with the reporting process, the investigation, or the way that they've received care after abuse. These are all things that can be brought up to a PCM. When a survivor is facing retaliation for reporting or is facing ongoing harassment, such as being consistently misgendered by staff, this is another time that we may be able to advocate on our clients' behalves. Medical needs are also something that often come up in conversations with clients. A client may need follow-up STI testing after an assault, or may be facing issues getting their regular medication. While we are not medical professionals, we may be able to provide a secondary voice to their concerns. Sometimes we have to parse out what kind of advocacy we can really do on behalf of a survivor. They may be asking you to contact the governor on their behalf, but what their main concern is really about their housing and remaining on single cell status. This is why it's so important for us to make sure we have a strong understanding of what the survivor hopes to gain as a result of our advocacy efforts. In this example, it may make most sense for us to talk to the PCM about their concerns, as they would have more control over a survivor's movement and housing than someone like the governor. When we're doing any work on behalf of a survivor, we want to be very clear about what we're doing. You will need to explain what you're going to say, to whom, and what the possible outcomes there might be. You will want to make sure you're being honest and be careful not to overpromise anything. This is especially important as it can be hard for a survivor not to get excited if you're helping them in this way. While your word often carries more weight for facility staff than the word of those who are incarcerated, this doesn't mean that you saying something will change something for that survivor. Make sure that survivors know this. You will also want to be truthful. Make sure if you said you would talk to the PCM that week that you actually do so and follow up with the survivor about that conversation. Always weigh the pros and cons of advocacy with a survivor. Retaliation is not allowed, but that doesn't mean that it isn't a very real and common thing that many survivors behind bars face, especially when attention is brought to issues inside a facility. Always let your clients know that there may be unintended negative results as a result of your advocacy, and talk through potential safety plans to help if this happens. As always, when you're going to advocate on behalf of a survivor, make sure you get a release of information. You can send the release in a letter. You can also fill one out with that person in person during a forensic exam, or if necessary, you can fill one out with the client while you're on the phone with them. When you're providing advocacy on behalf of a client, it will most usually be in the form of you talking to your main contact, usually the PCM or the head of medical or mental health at the facility. This is where having a strong relationship with the facility comes into play. The better your relationship is with different staff at the facility, the more your opinion and words will be heard. This may mean being strategic about who you talk to about what issues and how often you go to your contacts about advocacy concerns, and most importantly, how you actually word your concerns. You will always want to communicate in a professional manner, even when you're appalled by how your client is being treated. Unfortunately, when we are working in the system, it's important to be prepared for nothing to happen as a result of your efforts. Yet, it's important for us to stay grounded in those efforts. These systems move glacially, and even those in power at the facility level are beholden to those at power at the agency level. It's important to keep pushing for the level of care, dignity, and safety you know that all people are entitled to. And it's also important to avoid burning out because you feel like you aren't making the impact you're expecting to make. The ability to help even one person on the road to healing justifies our efforts. It's also important that we're documenting any advocacy efforts so that we have a record of who we spoke to, what we said, and how many times we brought it up. Keeping this kind of documentation can be helpful in recognizing patterns of concern at a particular facility and may also help if your facility is getting an audit so that you're able to speak to an auditor about these patterns. There may be times when advocating to facility staff is not enough, and you feel that contacting the oversight body of that facility or that agency makes the most sense. Through the Office of the Sexual Abuse and Detention Elimination Ombudsperson, the Office of the Inspector General is responsible for overseeing what happens inside California state prisons and ensures the impartial resolution of inmate sexual abuse complaints. The Ombudsperson has the authority to inspect all CDCR institutions and review all folks who are incarcerated there. The OIG investigates reports of mishandling of incidents of sexual abuse within correctional facilities and may be able to provide assistance, such as a transfer, to prisoners who have been victims of sexual abuse. For those of you who have never used an oversight agency before, they can be especially helpful if you've noticed very alarming rights violations of survivors. You can contact them on survivors' behalf, and you can also encourage your client to contact them directly. While incarcerated, a survivor can write confidentially to the ombudsperson at the address above, and make sure to let your survivor know to mark the envelope as legal mail. From there, the OIG will contact officials at the prison to determine if a report of alleged abuse has been made and determine the status of the investigation. It's important to note that both the identity of the survivor and that of the perpetrator will likely become public once the OIG gets involved. We want to encourage you to share this information with survivors so that they can self-advocate anytime that they feel like their case is not being handled properly, and so that you can use it as well if you feel like your client is unable to contact them directly or there has been a pattern of concern that you believe needs to be brought to their attention. So let's take a look at a brief scenario together. So as we go over this scenario, I encourage you to type your answers into how you might respond into the chat box if you have thoughts about how you would handle this situation. So in this scenario, you've been writing back and forth with a client for some time now. They were assaulted 4 years ago by another inmate at a different facility. They had made a report which was investigated and the case was found to be substantiated. They let you know that the perpetrator, who they haven't seen since the assault, has been moved to the same housing unit that they are currently in and they feel unsafe. They ask you to advocate on their behalf, provide you with a release of information to contact the PCM at your facility. So how might you handle this situation? Think about how you would communicate with the survivor, the PCM, or others, and how you would document your advocacy. Let's see, we have one respondent saying that they would try to get a hold of the people they've built relationships with within the agency and see how quickly they could get the issue addressed and work from there to come up with a more long-term solution. Yeah, great idea. Yeah, really always trying to rely on people that you already have a solid relationship with, because again, those are going to be the folks that are more likely going to take action. Looks like one person would contact with their client's permission about the offender rehabilitation coordinator. Fantastic. So again, every jurisdiction is going to have a different contact, different oversight bodies, so it's important to think about that. Great. Another person said they might mail a letter to the Inspector General to ask for assistance. Another person said that they would be really careful to validate the feelings and concerns of the survivor. Always really important. Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you bring up there, Carrie. We want to make sure we're doing advocacy, but that we're still providing the emotional support that that person may have. Absolutely. Yeah, so they would encourage for the movement of the perpetrator rather than of the survivor. Great point. See if the survivor can be moved to a facility. Again, I think Jamie's kind of on the right track. If we can move the perpetrator, that would be great. But again, as advocates, we don't have the power to move people. So it's really important that we're encouraging the facility to make that positive move. We have some thoughts about getting ROIs. I'm just reading through some of your responses here. Great. Make sure you let the survivor know about their rights. Absolutely. Safety planning is going to be really important. Fantastic. Making sure you're getting their consent. Absolutely. You want to make sure you have their consent before you go to anyone. Great. You guys have some really, really fantastic responses, and I really appreciate you thinking that through. So this is a pretty like standard case that might come up. A lot of clients have housing concerns, and this may be a place that you can provide advocacy. Another really important thing to think about when we're thinking about housing is to understand the PREA standards, because there are several standards that address housing directly. So this might be a place to kind of fall back on those PREA standards, especially if you're talking to your PCM at your facility. Again, thank you for all your responses. So knowing how to advocate on behalf of our clients is going to be incredibly important, especially if we're going to start one-on-one in-person supportive services. Again, once you have those solid relationships with your facility and have developed strong and sustainable programs for forensic exam accompaniment, letter writing, and hotline services for incarcerated survivors, that next step might be to be looking into starting in-person one-on-one support within your facility. So as always, we really like to keep the stories of survivors as a central part of any training we provide. And we're going to play a short video shortly. And I do want to kind of warn people, we have seen that sometimes the videos don't work, but I will want to remind you that this is going to be sent out to you all later. So if it's not working for you, it will play later. And it's only a short video, about 1.5 minutes long. But just to give you a little bit of a recap about who we'll be hearing from. So in this video, we have Tom Cahill, who was gang raped and beaten while detained at a Texas jail. He had been arrested for civil disobedience after participating in a labor strike. Tom is a veteran human rights advocate committed to confronting, challenging, and correcting social injustices. He served as a board member of JDI from 1998 to 2006. His efforts culminated in the passage of the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003, the first federal civil law to address prisoner rape. Tom is a member of JDI's Survivor Council. This video was created with support from a grant from the Office of Victims of Crime.
My name is Tom Cahill. I was 31 in 1968 when I was raped in jail. I've been in a lot of therapy, and I've done a lot of study on my own, trying to heal from the trauma. I used to have flashbacks where I'd pace a room, just yelling and screaming in silence. Initially, what helped me heal was joining a women's rape support group in Napa, California. At first, the women, were a little leery of me, but as soon as I told my story, I felt accepted right away, especially by the facilitator, and I felt really good that we established rapport right away. And that helped a lot. Talking about it, that was helpful. And writing, I estimate I've written 100 articles, maybe 12 that were published, and that's always helped a lot. Trying to raise consciousness.
So we have one response here that said that they were surprised that Tom joined a women's support group and was sort of wondering around that. So in response to that, the time that this happened to Tom was quite some time ago. So it was actually before rape crisis centers really opened up their services to support men, as Tom was kind of really on the spearheading a lot of really great services that became for men after this. So I think that's part of the reason that he was only able to find a women's support group. Great question. Yeah, lots of thoughts about him having to join an all-women support group. And I think that's why it's so important that we're making sure all of our services are applicable for folks of all genders. Thank you for sharing the thoughts and reactions you've had to this video. Again, we always want to center the voices of survivors. And we think it's always very important to bring it back to them. All right. So in terms of the support we give survivors, it's very hard to beat the impact of in-person, one-on-one support. And if this is something you're able to provide to survivors at your facility, you'll want to think through some internal setup before you begin that. For those who are just getting started doing in-person support for survivors behind bars, a great place to start is to determine what your capacity is for going into the facility. Perhaps it's only once a month, or maybe you have more time and can go once a week. Make sure to ask about programming and when makes the most sense for when survivors will actually have the time to meet with you. One idea is to set up a regularly reoccurring day and time that you'll be at the facility. So if you've determined you can only go once a month, for example, maybe you could go every third Tuesday at, say, 11 a.m. Once you have that set up, it's really important that whether or not you have clients on your list that day, that you're still showing up, as this gives you the opportunity to connect with facility staff and for them to get familiar with your presence. You're also going to need to think through how you're actually going to be able to see clients. So if you go to the facility once a week, are you able to see all your clients weekly? How long do you want your sessions to be? Do you want a max number of sessions that you can do? You want to make sure that these practices are clear and are written up in some way so that a client has a strong understanding of your capacity before you begin those services. Another thing to be really upfront with is your agency's policy regarding boundaries. Advocates are professionals who seek to help others, but just as in the community, some people may reach out to you for reasons other than their own healing. It's best practice for all advocates to know upfront what is and what is not allowed, and to empower advocates to terminate services if boundaries are set and then are crossed by a client. If you are ever being threatened or harassed by a client, that is never okay, and you do have the right to terminate services with that person. It can be helpful to have a strong policy and protocols in place so that if this happens and this comes up, that you can fall back on that policy and feel like you can terminate services in the best, most trauma-informed way as possible for both your client and your advocate. You'll want to make sure your agency's policies for your counseling program work for individual services with incarcerated survivors. So for instance, what are your policies on cancellation or mediums of communication? Make sure to revise any current policies to include the needs of those who are incarcerated. There are also some external pieces that you will need to be putting into place. You'll need to find a confidential place to meet with your clients, regardless of the security level of their housing. Many advocates will meet with survivors in the same place that a lawyer meets with a client in, as that is often the most confidential space to meet with folks. Others will use a room in medical or mental health area, in a classroom, or even in a staff office. Next, you'll have to have a clear way that survivors can sign up for your in-person service. So a good place to start is through a self-referral through your hotline, a letter, or a forensic exam. If this is the case, you'll need to make sure to get the survivor's permission, and best practice would be to also get a release of information for you to see them in person and to work with the facility to set that up. You can also create a referral process for those who disclose at intake and with mental health staff within the facility. You will need to develop a system with the facility on how survivors are actually able to meet with you once you're inside. In some facilities, the survivor may be able to walk to where you are with the permission from staff and a ducket, which is essentially CDCR's version of a hall pass. Others may need to be escorted by security staff, in which case you'll need to be mindful of confidentiality. If your client is in SHU or lockup, you may need to go to them. Finally, it's always good to have a plan in place of emergencies. So think about developing this plan with mental health staff, especially in case clients are in imminent danger. Our work with clients behind bars will look very similar to when we do in-person support sessions with clients in the community, and your skills and the way you walk through sessions should look very similar. One thing that may take a little more time than it does for a survivor in the community is rapport building. It is vital to build some level of trust with your client before diving into the healing work with them. You're going to be able to leave the facility at the end of the day, and your client cannot. This creates an inherent power dynamic that is important to be aware of. You'll want to be mindful that folks that are incarcerated may be more distrustful of outsiders, professionals, and mental health workers than people who are in the community. This is why you need to make sure that you're really taking the time to meet the client where they're at and try to get to know them and hear their experiences. You will need to demonstrate that you can be trusted and follow through with promises and be honest and transparent about what you can and cannot do. As with any client, you will want to make sure to set the goals of your work together with the survivor. This may be done on the phone or via letter prior to your in-person visit, and you'll want to review these goals and make sure they're consistent with what the survivor is still looking for. As always, just a quick word of caution about providing referrals. While in the community, we generally provide strong referrals to outside organizations, this may not be possible for folks in prison. Outside referrals may not have experience working with people who are within facilities or cannot be accessed by someone who is incarcerated. And referrals to programs and people within the facility have often already been tried by the survivor and may be problematic or lacking. If applicable, you'll always want to validate your client's feelings and normalize any trauma reactions that they bring up. Providing psychoeducation on trauma reactions may be applicable as well. Some survivors may want to use your time together to process and share their trauma experiences, and it's important to keep in mind that most survivors who are incarcerated come with a multitude of trauma experiences and may want to process things including child sexual abuse, adult sexual assault, intimate partner violence, or simply the trauma of being incarcerated. You may also have the opportunity to work on coping skills with your survivors during in-person sessions, and this may be the bulk of your work together. Given that resources are limited in a detention setting and that trauma reactions may be heightened for someone who's incarcerated, coping skills we offer may look different than the skills and plans we offer up to folks in the community. We'll talk through some coping skills later in this section. Finally, you will always want to plan for follow-up. Make sure your client understands when you can see them again, or when they can write or call your center. Life in prison can be incredibly unstable, and it's important to have a plan in place in case your client gets transferred before you're able to see them again. Be aware that each session could be your last, and to include an element of ending in each session. So an element of ending could include anything from reviewing a person's goals and plans to saying one thing about that person's progress. Just make sure that they understand how they can follow up with you or a different agency. All right, so before we talk a little bit more about coping skills, we want to take another quick poll. So the question on the poll is, what coping mechanisms have you shared with an incarcerated survivor? So please check the appropriate responses and click submit. And you can always check multiple answers. If you select other, please write into the questions panel what those other skills that you've offered are. Looks like we're still getting some responses here. Thank you for everyone that's writing in. Some folks that included some other. We have some people that have offered guided imagery for a safe space. That's fantastic. Grounding techniques, always really great. Coloring and art, really great if the client has access to those things, but again, always being mindful that someone might not have access to that. Grounding again, deep breathing, visualization, fantastic. Working out, reading, positive affirmations, great. Prompted journaling, fantastic. Exercise, yeah, exercise can be really, really great for folks that are already doing it, great. Self-help books and reading if they're able to have access to that, great. Talking to other people, great. Talking to support people, fantastic. Really, really important to make sure folks are connected. Joining any support groups, individual counseling, great. All right, so thank you all for your responses. It looks like folks have given a really large variety of different coping skills, so thank you for sharing that. These are really, really great responses. And for folks that have provided different coping skills, you know, as we've talked about before, and we will continue to talk about, coping skills that require little or no extra materials or that can be done without attracting attention often tend to be the safest and best options for survivors who are behind bars. And of course, it's always best practice that we're talking through these coping strategies to a survivor And we're really trying to see what they're already using so that we can build on that instead of suggesting something that isn't going to fit with their life. And again, we offer out these skills. We're not suggesting them. We're not offering advice. We're really just putting them out there as an option. So some of the things that we like to offer out are things like progressive muscle relaxation, journaling, and mindfulness, as they can all be powerful coping skills used for folks who are behind bars who don't have access to a lot of resources. And again, when we're offering out these coping skills, we want to make sure that we're really practicing them in person when we're meeting with a client and really walking through those skills. So that way, when they take it and they do it themselves, that they have that practice behind their belt. So progressive muscle relaxation, or PMR, can be a really great tool to give a survivor behind bars, as it's not easily identified when someone's doing it and requires no extra materials. So for those who aren't familiar with it, PMR is an exercise that relaxes your mind and your body by progressively tensing and relaxing different muscle groups throughout your entire body. And we've recreated a handout that you can use to help guide a client through this process. And this handout is available in the handout section of the webinar, which you can see in the panel on the right. Journaling is also another great tool to offer clients, and there's a variety of prompts that you can offer to survivors that are having trouble getting started. So if a survivor is interested in journaling but are worried about confidentiality, advocates can suggest that survivors tear up the writing and throw it away in different trash bins to make sure their journals are never read. And as we know, journaling will look different for every survivor. It can also be an overwhelming process to decide where to start. So we encourage you to provide your client with a few strategies and let them decide what's going to work best for them. And some different prompts for writing is some survivors, and I know someone mentioned this, may use journaling as a way to process trauma or as an outlet to say everything they wish they could to an abuser. Journaling might also be a good way to think about their obstacles to being safe, and then they could write plans around these challenges. Some other folks have written down positive affirmations so that they have them readily available to see or read when they're feeling anxious or depressed. Another coping skill that we've brought up is mindfulness. Mindfulness includes focusing on sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touch, as well as an awareness to one's own bodily sensations. Be aware that this may be particularly challenging for survivors, especially if their primary coping skill has been to numb or distract or ignore distressing sensations or thoughts. So always encourage people to start with short periods of meditation to begin with. But with time and consistent practice, mindfulness and grounding techniques can help build more connections between different areas of the brain, help slow down reactivity, and increase some of the senses to the body as a whole. So when you're providing one-on-one in-person support, there are a few things to prepare for that might come up. So anytime you're in a facility, you may run across staff who are either unfamiliar or dismissive of your role and the services that you provide to survivors. You're going to want to make sure that you're able to explain who you are and why you're there. That being said, you're also going to want to make sure that you can maintain confidentiality of your clients and that you're not being called the PREA person and clients aren't being called out for talking to you, as that would violate their confidentiality. Another thing to think about, and I know we spoke about this briefly, is how frequently clients are transferred. Always check in with your website, the CDCR website or the jail website inmate list to make sure that your client is still at the facility before you show up. So once you're there, and perhaps you are there and your client doesn't come to you, remember that there may be many reasons why your client was unable to show. Perhaps their housing changed, maybe they were added to a different work program, or maybe staff isn't allowing them to see you. Keep this in mind and try to advocate to talk to your client directly so that you can figure out what's going on from them. As we mentioned earlier, building rapport with your client is a very important piece to building trust. This may mean that your client takes more time before they start talking about the abuse that you're there with them to work with them on. So maybe there's just a massive fight that happened. Your client may need to process that before they talk about the abuse that they've been through, maybe as a child, even if that's what you had planned to talk about. It's important to be flexible. It's enough to be a supportive presence for a survivor, even if sexual abuse is not their main topic of conversation right off the bat. Many clients need multiple sessions to build trust before talking about abuse, and it's important to think about that you may want to offer more sessions to clients who are incarcerated than you normally would to clients in the community. Finally, if you're being denied access to see your client or to the facility itself, you want to make sure you're doing your best to try to get inside when it's safe and to stress the importance of sessions. If you're still unable to see them, you'll want to make sure to communicate with your client via letter or phone if possible, why you couldn't see them and when you'll be back. I know this final point is going to come up for us later, especially with the coronavirus outbreak. A lot of you are being barred from your facility, so that's something we can talk about at the end of this presentation. So we're going to work through another quick scenario. And again, please write into the questions panel about how you might respond. So in the scenario, you're seeing a client for the second time. They initially contacted your agency via the hotline and let staff know about sexual harassment that they had been experiencing. You were able to set up to see them in person. During your first session, they didn't really talk about the sexual harassment, but they also had appeared very nervous, and you were only able to meet with them for about 20 minutes. In your second session, when you try to bring up the sexual harassment, they keep changing the topic and sharing about their medical concerns. So how might you shape your conversation with this client? Really great point. So it's really important to make sure that your client's safety is being addressed, so that you're not trying to delve into something that they can't get into, maybe because they're physically unsafe, maybe they believe that someone's listening, things like that. So it's a really great point to bring up. Also, someone else brought up, if they're bringing up medical concerns, that's probably what they need to address before they can talk about more traumatic events. Absolutely, thank you. You want to validate what they're going through. If possible, connect to outside resources. Explain that maybe their medical concerns are outside the scope of your services. Absolutely. Always important to reframe what you can and cannot do. Yeah. Making sure that they don't feel pressured to share if they're not ready to. Absolutely. Yeah, really building rapport. Making sure that they know what they talk with you is confidential, explaining what confidentiality means. Sometimes that's a little confusing for folks, so really explaining that in detail. That's really great. A lot of thoughts about making sure that you can connect them to some sort of medical help if possible. Really great. These are really fantastic answers. Thank you for those that participated. So I'm actually going to turn it over now to Marcella to talk about groups. So thank you for talking about one-on-one services.
Thank you, Chris. So not only is adjusting our services important to providing in-person counseling, but we also want to think about how we can adjust our work when developing groups in detention. Support groups can allow for our clients to make sense of the abuse they experience and provide a space to think about healing collectively, and that's not something that we get to see very often in those settings. So when you promote your agency's ability to serve incarcerated survivors and support groups, you're really advertising the value of all services for survivors in your community. So it's important to assess your agency's readiness to work with incarcerated survivors in a support group setting. And this is definitely not a exhaustive list to indicate whether you're ready to start coordinating and facilitating groups, but it certainly can be a helpful guide. So if you've been providing one-on-one in-person support services consistently with the support of at least one staff member from the facility, you may be ready to start facilitating groups. All of the skills that you hold when providing individual group counseling are useful when facilitating groups, just like validating and reflecting on feelings. So it's also important to consider the skills needed to facilitate conversations around coping mechanisms, the dynamics of sexual abuse in detention, and processing emotions in a really diverse group setting where folks participating are also living with each other. Advocates should really feel confident in their ability to facilitate difficult conversations, set boundaries, look out for triggers, and adapt to the group's personality. I think we know, as in the community, every group has a unique personality. So it's really important for group facilitators to be able to monitor those group dynamics, especially as far as any alliances within the groups or disagreements within the groups. And having a co-facilitator in the room is really helpful in being able to monitor those dynamics and at the same time facilitate a group. And last but not least, once you've established trust and built rapport with one or two CDCR staff members or jail staff members, you'll be able to begin the process of advocating for support groups. So having a description of group topics and activities to show facility staff will really help them understand the goals of the group, and improve the chances of receiving approval to facilitate those groups. So moving into planning for groups, you'll need to have a good conversation with your agency about your capacity to provide groups and the level of support you will be receiving from your colleagues. So here are just a few questions you can keep in mind during this conversation. So what kind of group will you be facilitating? And we'll talk a little bit more about different options for groups later in the webinar. You'll also want to weigh the option of doing an open versus a closed group. Closed groups have the benefit of creating consistency and the ability for folks to build more trust with each other and the co-facilitators. Some centers have offered closed-styled groups and only have participants who will be at the facility for 6 months or more. Open groups tend to work better in jail-type settings where there's more frequent movement, but it is difficult to maintain a sense of confidentiality and trust due to the fluctuation in participation. But regardless of how you decide you want to structure your group, the best groups happen the more we're able to set a strong structure in place and get full input from those that you're serving and will be facilitating the group for. And as in the community, you'll also want to figure out how people will sign up and what that screening process will look like. So it might be beneficial to have potential participants participate in an orientation session as part of the screening process to really ensure that the group is the right fit for them. This can also give you a preview of what the group dynamic will be like. And then you might figure out if there are any friends, ex-partners, and current partners in the group. This is something that you'll want to think about beforehand. Additionally, you want to think about whether being a survivor is a requirement for joining. Process-oriented groups or psychoeducational groups usually require that participants be a survivor of trauma and abuse. So it's suggested that, at least for the first group, that the group only be for survivors of sexual abuse and harassment. And after the first group, you may want to think about what it would look like to open the group up to people who are survivors of all forms of trauma and abuse, if that's something that's within your capacity and skill set to do so. And then you'll also want to think about whether your clients are going to be participating in one-on-one groups at the same time that they're in the group session. So in other words, it's, you know, if a client's working with you in one-on-one, you want to make sure that it's going to be beneficial to them to be in that support group and that they're ready to be in a group setting with folks talking about sexual abuse and sexual harassment. Again, we really want to make sure that you and your agency will feel you have the capacity to offer groups sustainably and consistently, as it's not often that survivors in detention have an opportunity to process trauma, make art, or learn about coping mechanisms in a non-judgmental group setting. So you'll want to think about how many sessions you have the capacity to offer, whether that's once a week or once a month. You'll really want to take into consideration that a 1-hour group can take several hours to prep, especially when thinking about travel time and getting in and out of the facility. You will also want to identify a co-facilitator that really complements your skills and attributes. We really encourage that you do have a co-facilitator and that you're not facilitating the group on your own, because it can really help manage and monitor group dynamics while you facilitate the group and vice versa. And they'll also be able to help you problem solve if there's an awkward group dynamic or some type of disruption. And then later on, once the group session is over, you'll have the opportunity to process with somebody who is present during that session. So it really helps to reduce those feelings of being overwhelmed. And so, you know, as always, make sure that anyone who's entering into the facility has some sort of experience working with incarcerated survivors and has been trained and has been cleared to enter the facility and has hopefully taken a tour of the facility as well, so that they're familiar with the different areas. You'll also want to assess how many people at a time can participate in your support group, and think about what is your minimum and maximum for groups in the community, and does that really translate well to the detention setting that you're working in. And also think about how you're going to prepare if not enough people are signing up for the group. Does that mean that you'll be meeting with the Men's Advisory Council or the Women's Advisory Council to help spread the word of mouth of the support groups? And just an FYI that these advisory councils are sort of mirrored to a student council, and you'll usually find these in CDCR facilities. I'm not sure what that would look like outside of the state of California. And so you'll also want to think about if you want to wait for the group until you have a larger group of clients. And then in future slides, we'll talk a little bit about more about how advertising plays a role in inviting survivors to participate in your groups. And lastly, in the case that there is over enrollment, you'll want to prepare for those future groups and create a wait list. So just as you'll want to begin planning groups with your agency, you'll also want to work with your facility. Throughout the webinar, we've talked so much about building relationships with the facility. So these are just a few questions that you can start to ask facility staff and potential participants as you begin to plan the logistics of your group. So you'll want to figure out which units can have groups, and you may want to ask whether the groups will be accessible to people in different units. You'll also want to ask how survivors will be traveling to and from the group, and whether participants will need ducats. As Chris mentioned, these are used by CDCR staff as sort of a hall pass for folks that are incarcerated. And this will be coordinated with your point person at your facility to really ensure the most confidentiality possible. And when you start to decide the date and time of the group, you'll want to consult with facility staff and potential participants, and really avoid scheduling the groups at the same time as any other programming in case the folks that are in your group want to participate in other programming. You'll also want to know what time meals are scheduled so that they don't collide with that time. And then you'll want to think about if your agency can commit to providing groups in the evening or on the weekend if that's really the best time for groups to occur in the facility. And you know, just make sure that the scheduling is realistic for your agency, but also fits into the facility structure. And then as you begin to think about topics and activities that you're interested in offering, you'll want to ask what kind of materials you're allowed to bring in for the group, and what kind of materials survivors are allowed to keep after the group is done. And if you're not able to bring certain materials, you'll want to go ahead and adapt the activity or change the activities that you're thinking of offering. And just a few more questions to think about when speaking to the facility. You'll want to speak to them about whether there are certain restrictions for participation based on someone's classification within the prison. You'll want to ask if the groups will be confidential or if staff will need to be present. And in this case, that they are not able to be confidential, you really want to weigh the pros and cons of a non-confidential group, and really continue to advocate for a confidential group as needed. And finally, you will need to determine who will approve the support group. We really recommend that you work from a structure and have a plan that includes descriptions of the group topics, different types of activities you'll be using, and then any handouts that you can share with the facility staff. And you know, during the group, you may see the need to adjust the plan and be flexible, which is, you know, definitely highly recommended. But in many cases, a structure and sort of a plan is required by the facility. And so, you know, just be thinking ahead about that. So when you're marketing the group, you'll want to make sure that the way that it's marketed is inclusive of all survivors. Groups should be applicable and offered to people of all genders. We've sort of seen a tendency to offer things like art-based groups only to women, but men can really benefit from these types of groups as well. And I know this came up in previous conversation. We really want to make sure that the groups are catered to everybody, regardless of gender. And you'll want to consider, you know, language, colors, and images carefully when developing those marketing materials. Thinking about also you know, if your rape crisis agency may have women in the name, and so maybe that looks like just showing an acronym or some type of logo, so that people don't be, you know, aren't discouraged from participating in the group if they're not women. And so all elements, like I said before, should be chosen with the aim of making the group more inclusive and approachable. And when you're advertising the group, you'll want to include information on how to join the group and a brief description of what that group will entail. And you may even want to share marketing material and the brief draft description of the group with the Inmate Advisory Council, like I mentioned earlier, to ensure that it's advertised in a way that resonates with survivors at your facility. And so just really want to emphasize how important it is to be checking in if you're in a CDCR facility with the Inmate Advisory Council. Oftentimes, if you don't know what that means, sometimes folks will call it MAC or WAC for short. And so really learning from them will make sure that you don't waste any time in developing a group structure or format that doesn't provide what survivors at the facility are really looking for, or that it's advertised in a way that would be off-putting to them. So as in the community, facilitators will often need to work through the shame and guilt connected to talking about sexual abuse. Fear of retaliation, fear of appearing weak, and any shame around being a victim are really compounded in a detention setting, and ultimately contribute to a code of silence that may be felt in your own group. So groups that allow survivors to process and heal from trauma behind bars are incredibly rare and will take some time getting used to, and you'll really need to meet participants where they're at. Experiences with oppression and marginalization before and during incarceration may also lead to a distrust in co-facilitators or other participants. So I think, again, including that option to participate in an orientation session and in meeting with you prior, or making it a requirement to have in-person services with you beforehand may sort of help with that. And so this may also mean that individuals or groups will also be working through years of isolation. In these instances, participants might be worried about speaking openly in a group setting after becoming more accustomed to social isolation. And this will really require you to be creative about the activities and discussions you develop for the group to encourage discussion, and also alternative forms of participation that don't always require verbally sharing one's experiences or processing their trauma. And so just a quick note that participants might also think that the group will get canceled or that the facilitators will stop showing up after a while. So, you know, it's really important to show up to all groups. And in the case that the group needs to be canceled, you really do your best to notify participants beforehand, whether that's in the previous session or in a letter. So groups offered to people in detention settings run the spectrum from psychoeducational groups. We've seen process-oriented groups, art-based healing groups, and in some cases, prevention-based groups. And so there's really some pros and cons to facilitating any type of group. So let's go ahead and talk about those. So psychoeducational groups provide people with the tools to make changes to how they think and feel about themselves and make sense of the abuse they have experienced. In these types of groups, the facilitator provides information about specific topics related to trauma and coping mechanisms, understanding power and control, isolation, self-forgiveness, rebuilding social connections, and freedom. These types of groups provide survivors the tools to heal and cope from the trauma and abuse they experienced, but they are not the type of group where survivors process their trauma or tell their stories. Process-oriented support groups lead people to discuss and share their experiences in a group setting. Peer support and validation is shown to increase each survivor's self-esteem. With this type of group, it's suggested that all of the group members be survivors of sexual assault and harassment. Because this group is process-oriented and likely will include a lot of storytelling, you'll need to provide some structure to the group. This may be the type of group where some folks feel more comfortable sharing and others feel more comfortable listening. So providing time limits can not only help create that sort of balance, but it also serves as a reminder to anyone participating that they can pull back from their memories at any time, especially when they become too triggering. So healing arts groups can include the creation of art, body movement, and dancing in a healing and therapeutic movement. With this type of group, it may be challenging to get the materials necessary to facilitate the group. You may be able to adapt activities to include minimal materials, or it may be that the facility does allow you to use the materials necessary. So always just make sure to plan ahead and ask facility staff what is and is not allowed. And so healing arts groups allow participants to express themselves from where they are in that moment without the pressure of verbalizing their emotions or thoughts. This means that survivors can choose to share as much or as little as they want. It also gives participants the opportunity to participate in the group or work as an individual. In this type of group, you can choose to have a mixed group, or you may want to choose to solely have survivors involved. It's up to you. And so prevention groups include conversations and activities related to understanding consent and boundary setting, power and control, the dynamics of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, and healthy relationships, as well as bystander intervention. They really introduce the idea that sexual assault is preventable, not inevitable. And for many survivors, this may be a healing idea to experience and implement. Growing up, many people learn that sexual violence was only preventable if the victim or the survivor changed their behavior and their actions, not the abuser or the rapist. In these groups, participants will be able to really play an active role in preventing sexual violence. Prevention groups can include mixed groups, but survivors should really be further along in their recovery process in order to participate in prevention groups. So just some tips for facilitating groups, and obviously this isn't an exhaustive list, but could be helpful. So you'll really want to have a plan and hold it lightly. Although leading a group in detention requires a bit of flexibility, you still want to have that structure and consistency. So for example, at the beginning of each group, you can discuss the goal of the session and the format of each meeting. Groups usually start with check-ins and lead up to learning and discussion, and may end with some activities and a checkout to close the session. And really outlining this process can help reduce some participants' feelings of anxiety about the group process and being vulnerable in a group setting. And you could even provide participants with a schedule during an orientation session or on the first day of the group to prepare them for upcoming topics. And you'll want to have one or two alternative activities to make space for multiple types of participation for your participants. As a facilitator, it can be really helpful to participate in the activities before sharing them in the group. Even presenting the examples you've created can ease participants' pressure to create something that is quote unquote perfect. You can also work on the activities with the participants. This can really help equalize the power differences that are often felt between facilitators and participants. You know, hovering over participants can really create a sense that they're at school and being tested, or that they're being watched, while creating something potentially private and intimate. And because movements within the facility are likely to be restricted, you won't be able to suggest that members step out if they need time to process alone or one-on-one with you. So you may want to create a separate space in the room for folks that need alone time or one-on-one time. And lastly, you may want to create a list of agreements to create a cohesive group dynamic. However, regardless of the agreements you set at the beginning of the session, conflict may arise. Remember, you're working with people who are living together and have relationships with each other outside of the group. So be sure to be aware of these dynamics and tread carefully, especially when asking more open-ended check-in questions. And you can always refer back to the objectives you shared at the beginning of the session in order to recenter the conversation and the activity. And so we do have a list of agreements that we created for you to modify, and we've uploaded the list of agreements onto the CALCASA PREA webpage. It's also under the handouts list in the control pane. And so again, always be sure to modify for your own group. And so there's really many ways to introduce the group agreements. One way to frame the group agreements would be to brainstorm ways to feel safe or brave as individuals, and think of ways to normalize possible responses to triggers within the group. You could write the agreements on a flip chart if that's something that's accessible within the facility. You could also provide the group with a set of agreements and then add on to the agreements. This provides structure as well as the opportunity to co-create the group's safety and comfort. And you can also add agreements as the sessions progress. Whether you start out with a list of agreements or start from scratch with your group, creating agreements together can be an activity in and of itself. And always remember that there are already a lot of rules within the facility, so we want to make sure that any of your agreements aren't in contrast with the facility's rules, and also be sure that your group agreements don't feel like you're adding more rules to someone's already very regimented life. So one of the main goals of a support group is to provide survivors with a sense of hope that makes the idea of healing possible and believable. The support group is really meant to assist in healing from trauma, but many trauma survivors may not want to return to the group if the group creates an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. So you'll want to end each session with a sense of closure. So closing the session is a time to reflect and share with the group if the participants feel comfortable doing so. You can remind participants that listening to others is also participating. And you can pose a question to the participants that really allows them to continue to reflect and continue to actively heal outside of the group. And oftentimes groups in the community will allow participants to take home their art or creations. In a detention setting, this may not be possible, but you can offer alternatives. You can offer to keep their art as examples for other groups, or use them as anonymous art displays at your center or at a local art walk or gallery if the opportunity arises. But as always, make sure to get consent before you share their creations with anybody. And at the end of each group, you'll want to make sure you provide information about the next group session, like the date, time, and topic. If someone knows they will be transferred or released, be sure to take time to talk to them after the group with and discuss how they can continue some sort of services, wherever they go. If they're interested in connecting with the advocate in their service area, please do so. And at the end of each session, you'll also want to make sure that you have time to pass out and collect evaluations. And so we always receive feedback during the support groups, but you should also be sure to have participants complete a group evaluation. The post-group evaluations help assess the facilitators and the content and the overall group experience. It may include statements like, the group was a safe place to share my concerns, and the activities helped me learn and understand the information. You can also use the evaluations to accommodate language or literacy levels, decide on whether to introduce new topics or dive more deeply into specific topics, or improve the dates and times for the next support groups. Their feedback will be able to refine and improve upcoming groups, but also be careful to eliminate anything that one person did not like or enjoy. It's possible that they were really the only person who didn't enjoy this activity or topic, so make sure you're checking in with participants as the group moves along as well. So we're nearing the end of the webinar, and we want to go ahead and almost kind of end with a group scenario. So things can often come up in groups that we're not really anticipating or expecting. So let's go ahead and talk through this scenario. And again, go ahead and type your answers into the question pane if you have any thoughts about how you would handle this situation. So you're facilitating a support group, and members have really started opening up and feeling safe sharing their experiences. But suddenly, as one of the members is speaking, the door opens and a staff member announces it's pill time. How would you respond? And think about how you could help bring the group back together and really recreate that sense of safety. So again, go ahead and reread the group scenario and think about how you would respond to this. Okay, so we have our first response, someone saying, ask them to politely close the door, let the member finish speaking, and explain to the group when the next group will be. Letting the person who interrupted that will be done in a few minutes, please come back. Yeah, and in the case that you have a really good relationship with your facility, you may be able to let them know to come back at a different time. Tell the person talking, John, you can please hold on a minute, then reinforce to the staff members this is a confidential space, and ask them if they can wait a few minutes, or if they can just notify the group members, we will get started when meds are done. So yeah, I think there's two different options. If you feel comfortable and you feel like you are able to let that staff member know to come back at a different time, that's probably the best case scenario. Yeah, most people are saying give us a minute or two to talk to the inmates before they have to leave. Yeah, and in the case that that you're unable to let the staff person know to leave or to come back at a different time, having a conversation with the staff to let them know that the group is confidential and that it would be best practice for them to, knock on the door before interrupting the class. That way, at least you and your co-facilitator and participants in the group feel respected. Yeah. Yeah, someone's saying, remind myself that I'm able to provide this service at the pleasure of the facility, although those needing meds to receive them then process in group and seek feedback on how participants would like to respond. So yes, thank you all for your responses. I wish I could read all of them, but we do need to move forward since we are in our last couple minutes of the webinar. So thank you all, great responses.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Marcella. We want to, as we're kind of winding down our presentation here, we want to return again to Tom Cahill, who spoke so powerfully about the importance of advocacy in detention, as we saw earlier. As part of his journey toward healing, Tom said, "At first I felt shame and humiliation. Later I realized that it was not my shame, it was my country's shame." So the work of advocates like yourselves in helping those who have suffered like Tom is just one part of making our society and our world a little more whole. We want to leave you with some resources that may be of use to you or your colleagues who are just coming into this work. This toolkit, Access for All, was written specifically for advocates who are beginning to partner with CDCR prisons, but it contains much information that would be relevant to any agency embarking into work in detention. In addition to the toolkit, additional training is always recommended. We've created a facilitator's guide with a script, as well as corresponding presentation slides that you can use to train advocates at your agency. Links to these resources will be included in the follow-up email today, along with a copy of a link to download the slides. Answers to many of your questions can be found at CALCASA and JDI's website, and we turn to the PREA Resource Center when we have a tricky question that we need guidance on. That's a great resource. Now, we do have a little bit of time, just about 5 minutes or so for questions. You can type any questions you have in the pane of the control panel, and please don't self-censor. All questions are valid. We want to know where you're at. And if we can't answer your question right away, we will follow up with you later. Well, here's one question that I see. It would be nice to hear what groups people are doing at their prisons. And yeah, let's take a quick poll and find out. If you can answer this poll, we can take a little survey here and see what people are doing in response to Deb's question. Well, just fewer than half responding at this point. It looks like the biggest number, the leader so far, is psychoeducational groups. About 30% of responders have provided those groups. 10% of responders are working with prevention groups, which is the second place, with healing arts and process-oriented support groups both tied at about 5%.
Thank you for those that responded to the poll. So we have a couple of other questions that we got here, and I know we're almost out of time, but we're open to keeping the webinar open for an extra few minutes to answer these. And again, if you feel like your question isn't answered, please feel free to reach out to us outside of this webinar as well. We had a question at the beginning of this webinar specifically about coronavirus and being their facility being closed. So I think with that, the main thing to remember is both your safety and the safety of the people inside. So if your facility is saying it's closed for safety reasons, then that is a reason that you would not be going in. So it's really important that we're following the rules for facility safety in that sense. And I think that is really an opportunity for us to make sure that our phone lines are working the best that they can, and that we're able to do letter writing the best that we can as well, and thinking about sort of enhancing those services and increasing them, especially if you were previously going into your facility and you're not able to go in anymore. And also, to the best of your ability, to make sure you connect with clients that you are already seeing, so that they understand about why you're not going in. And once you hear back, and once we know a little bit more about when you think you're going to be back into the facility. I know that's not the easiest answer, but right now on it, that's kind of where things are at while we kind of wait to see what happens with everything. Let's see, some other great questions we have. So we have a question about what to do, what kind of resources we would suggest setting up for a survivor for when they leave the facility after they serve their sentence, coming from Sarah. So that's a really fantastic question. Thinking about post-release services might be a really great thing to do with clients if you're doing one-on-one sessions with them. But be mindful that if you're working within a prison population, most folks aren't going to be leaving for some time. So make sure you really have a strong understanding about when they're going to be leaving. And a lot of setting up kind of resources may not be tangible resources that you're setting up for someone, but really talking through the stress that transitioning back into the community might cause, and how you might be able to serve them through your rape crisis center, or how a different rape crisis center may be able to serve them depending on where they're going to get out. So I think a big question is about where they're going to be, where they think they're going to be, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different components to think about there. Great question. Sonia, I'm wondering if your question is specific, what resources you're specifically talking about for North Carolina, but all of the resources that we provided in this presentation do mostly apply to kind of any sort of facility, no matter where you are. The basics are really the same. We had another question here about how long folks have been inside the detention centers. I think, although I can't answer for everyone, I think it's a pretty big variety. We have some centers that have been going in for years and years, and we have some that are just starting. So it's hard to say kind of as a whole, but I will say that we're seeing it more and more that rape crisis centers are going into their detention facilities, which is very, very exciting. Let's see, really great question here. So I run a support group in a local jail, and it was mentioned it's hard to keep track of inmates as they fluctuate a lot. So they've had to change the group from not being so education heavily to being more support. And any suggestions that we might have about how to manage the educational aspect in that transient state. So I think you've kind of adapted already. I think that's really, really great. So in a jail setting, because people are in and out, sometimes even within hours, doing a group that is support-based and is closed might not be possible. So I think the transition you've already made to kind of doing more support is a great way to do it. Also, if you're going to do education, make sure that each session can be done separately. Like, you don't need the rest to kind of back up what you're talking about for the next session. They can all be standalone sessions. So really making sure there's really beginning, middle, end for that group. And that, that can definitely still be done. Just it takes a good bit of planning to make sure that it can be a standalone education-based group. We have a question about if hospice services are available within a facility. That is a question, Charles, that I honestly do not know the answer to. Happy to look into that. I can ask some of my colleagues and get back to you if I'm able to figure that out for you. And we have a question here from Brenda, is what is the success rate of support groups in helping inmates overcome their traumatic experience? I think that's a really interesting question, because success is hard to measure, right? So are we talking about someone's ability to cope? Is it gotten stronger? Or there's not really a great way to measure what success means. So I think that's part of the reason that we know that offering some kind of support is helpful. The more support we can offer, the better people can heal. And that's true for anyone, whether they're incarcerated or not. But really measuring that success is really, really complicated and difficult. I wish that we had a measure for something like that, but I don't think it's really possible for us to have a number on that, other than kind of knowing that what we do provide is a necessary service, which is why we're there in the community and why it's really important that we're inside facilities as well. A question here about hospital advocacy. I was mentioning hospice, so not hospital advocacy. I think most rape crisis centers are offering forensic exam accompaniment during a forensic exam at a hospital, but we had a question about hospice care, which I wasn't sure about. Let's see. Yeah, one of our responses here from Deb saying that inmates who have come to the group, that they've seen growth in how they handle situations, their anxiety levels, general feelings. Yeah, great way to measure that. To kind of ask how they were feeling before and take a poll and kind of see how they're feeling after. Looks like that is our questions that we have today. I really appreciate you all writing in here. Again, we're not going anywhere. This is what we do. We love answering your questions. So even if you didn't have the chance to ask it today, you're welcome to ask it later. It looks like we have one last question that came in, and then I'm gonna turn it back so we can finish this webinar. But we had a quick question from Brenda here asking if a client develops symptoms of possible schizophrenia, if a client is placed on a mental health ward for further observation. So that's really going to depend on the facility. Every facility handles things differently, so it's hard to give a full picture of what that would look like. Some facilities don't have a mental health ward, so they might be transferred to a different facility. Some facilities can handle it in-house, and some facilities might not feel that it meets the requirements of someone needing to go to a mental health ward. So it really is going to depend on what the facility is doing there.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone who asked a question. If you have further follow-up questions, we're always here to support you, as Chris mentioned, at either of these email addresses. And we do want to know how we did today. So in the follow-up email you'll be receiving today, it will include a certificate of attendance, but also with that will come a link to a survey. We would love it if you would take the minute or two it will take to complete. It's just a few questions. It will help inform our work going forward. We do always benefit from that perspective. So thank you in advance for the time you take to let us know how we did. You'll also get a link to the video with Tom Cahill. Thank you very much, one and all, for your time today, for your commitment to serving survivors, all survivors, including those who are incarcerated. We hope this webinar has helped make you feel like you have, like you at least know what you need to do to kind of get inside your facilities to do these services. And yeah, please be safe, be healthy, and we look forward to speaking with you again. Have a good day, everyone. Goodbye.